throughout the series of videos on 3D games and GameMaker, there has been one subject which I have just been largely avoiding for the better part of the last 5 years, mostly because it bores me. But because even I can't procrastinate everything forever, hello all the crazy people out there, my name is Michael, I like wizards and dragons and making games. Let's talk about gamma. So far when we've taken our point lights and our directional lights and our spotlights and whatever, and we've done our little m.ls on them to bounce light off of the normal of a vertex, or the normal of a fragment, depending. We've sort of been treating light and color as if it's an absolute thing, and because nothing is ever straightforward in computer graphics, of course it isn't. So I'm sure that everybody here is familiar with the concept of color spaces in at least some capacity. Whether that's RGB versus HSV versus HSL versus CMYK versus YUV versus YIQ versus YCBCR, insert XKCD here. And again, because nothing in computer graphics is simple, we are going to focus down on the RGB piece of what I just said. So the red, green, blue color space can actually be separated further into regular linear RGB versus what's known as sRGB, and for various historical reasons, partially involving like the physics of cathode ray tubes and doubling the input voltage of a beam of electrons, not necessarily doubling the output intensity of a color on the screen, and also just the fact that human eyes don't perceive colors in a linear fashion. Most of the images and graphics and pictures that you will store on a computer screen in a computer file, those are actually encoded in what is known as sRGB. And I'm going to say a lot of words like most of the time and usually because of course it's not always. Generally, when you go into an image editing software and you save a PNG or whatever, you're given the choice whether you want to use a linear or sRGB color profile. We're going to be assuming in this video, because I don't want to go insane, that by default most of the sprites and whatnot that you add into your GameMaker project are going to be stored in sRGB, as well as colors in general. And what that means is that if you want something that looks a little bit more physically accurate to how light works in the real world, you're going to need to convert from sRGB to linear RGB. You're going to need to do your lighting calculations there, and you're going to need to convert back before you put your final images on the screen. So if you have spent a certain critical amount of time reading about computer graphics on the internet, you have probably seen a graph that looks either like this, or maybe a diagram that looks like this. So the second one of those images, that is going to be a comparison of what people think of as linear brightness versus what is actually linear brightness in terms of like absolute color values. You are probably more used to thinking about the strip of rectangles on top because, again, that is what people think of as linear color. And that is indeed how values such as 25% brightness or 50% brightness might be stored in an image. Whereas the one on the bottom is more physically accurate in terms of like 25% of the photons reflecting off the surface or 50% of the photons reflecting off the surface. And going back to the first image, the one that looks sort of like a rotated violin plot thingy, this is a little graph that will demonstrate the conversion between linear color and scaled sRGB color. As a general rule, our eyes are pretty good at seeing differences in contrast in low light conditions, which means that if we're looking at something dark, we may often interpret it as being a little bit brighter than it is. And if we want to convert our sRGB images to linear color space, we'll have to do a little bit of math to correct for that, and then we'll have to do a little bit of math to uncorrect for it when we're done. So if I were to go and bring out the old trusty Desmos over here, the online graphing calculator. So if I were to say something like f of x equals x, this is obviously a linear plot. I'm going to constrain this between the range of 0 to 1. And we're basically going to recreate the little sideways violin plot that we were looking at earlier. The curves on the little sideways violin plot that were like above and below the straight line, that's going to be, let's call it g of x equals x raised to the power of 2.2, 0 to x to 1. I've realized that when you raise a number to a power that's greater than 1, most of the time you're used to the result being bigger than the input value, but because we are looking at the domain of numbers between 0 and 1, it's going to be lower than that because like the curve is only going to take off when the input value becomes greater than 1. And then our curve that was on the top, let's call it h of x equals x raised to the power of, and this is going to be 1 over 2.2, and let's once again constrain our domain there. And this is going to create like a little sideways violin plot, like onion sort of shape. I feel like when I look at this graph, I'm getting like the randomest like subpixel jitter, which is really weird. Does Desmos always do that, or is like... Maybe I'm just losing my mind. Anyway, so this is our little graph of linear versus sRGB color. If we want to take an sRGB color and convert it to linear, we are going to have to multiply it by basically this bottom curve. We're going to have to raise the input value by the power of 2.2. And if we want to go in the opposite direction, convert linear color to sRGB, we're going to have to go and do the inverse here. The 2.2 in these equations are sort of a magic number. That's just... you will find numbers that vary between like 2.0 and probably 2.5 when it comes to the gamma correction factor, as we're going to call it. It's just that 2.2 seems to be, for the most part, agreed upon to be the one that most people think looks best. I'm sure that if you really wanted to, you could like dissect a human eye, count the number of cone and rod cells, and figure out what the exponent should be. But that's above my pay grade. So let's get out of here. Let's go back to GameMaker. Our sample project here is a somewhat cleaned up version of one of the really early 3D lighting videos. I got rid of a bunch of the nonsense that we don't really need. We've got a spotlight shining on this ball over in the corner, and our player also has a little fairly like gentle point light that just follows us around so that we can see lighting on different objects as we pass by. Let's see, are there any other changes of note that I made here? I don't really think so. As I work on this, I'm going to be duplicating our original 3D lighting shader, and I'm going to, later in the video, I'm going to swap back and forth between them so that we can compare and see what's going on. So let me go and just set the shader that we're going to use to the 3D stuff gamma shader, and that is going to be the one that I actually edit here. By the way, it should go without saying, don't worry about any of this stuff until after you've already got a solid grasp of the basic 3D lighting math. The n.l's and the attenuation factors and all that fun stuff is way more important than correcting for gamma. I'm actually going to rant about that a little bit later in the video. So where do we want to start here? So our starting color, our diffuse color, is going to be v_v color, so the vertex color, multiplied by the color that you sample from the GameMaker texture. The GameMaker texture is, of course, going to be the image file that you load into GameMaker, which is probably going to be an sRGB format. I'm going to also lump vertex color in there because I'm going to assume that most people probably like figured out vertex color, painted it onto their 3D model just by using a color picker. And in all likelihood, a color picker such as that would be thinking in terms of sRGB also. So, to correct for that, we can say starting color equals the power of starting color. This also should be starting color to RGB because alpha is like not something you want to raise to a power here if you don't want to get weird results. We are going to raise starting color to the power of 2.2, and I believe the GLSL power function is not overloaded to work with like a vector type and a scalar. So we're going to have to go and raise our starting color to RGB to the power of a vector 3 containing all 2.2s like that. Otherwise, we'll get a compile error. And this is going to convert our starting color here, our sample color, from sRGB to linear color space. Okay, cool. That's really all there is to it. That's actually not quite all there is to it. So we're also going to want to give the same treatment to any other color that was defined like with artistic intent. Again, if you chose the color using a color picker in something like MS Paint or Photoshop, it's probably defined in terms of sRGB, and you probably are going to want to raise that color to the power of 2.2 to convert it to linear. This goes for the ambient light color. This goes for example, the color of the lights. This does not include anything that you might use color for in a shader which does not correspond to an actual physical color. So if you're sampling from a normal map or something like that, some kind of image which was generated programmatically, a bump map or a displacement map or something like that, then those colors should be left alone. Those should not be converted to and from RGB and linear. In raw OpenGL, and you might sometimes see this on the internet if you really want to do a lot more reading about this. In OpenGL, you can actually define sRGB, or the type of color space that every single image uses. Like when you set it as a texture in raw OpenGL, and then like when you sample from the texture, OpenGL will automatically do the conversion for you. GameMaker does not afford us any such convenience, so we're going to have to do this all ourselves. If you're getting tired of typing the hard-coded constant 2.2 all over the place, we can do a few things. We can define gamma to be 2.2, and then we can unmagic numberify that, as it were. I didn't do light color yet. And if you're really getting tired of typing out this power function, we can also just define a function. This is probably a little bit neater. We're just going to define a function that returns the power of the input raised to a vector 3 of gamma, like that. And then we can, instead of doing this whole thing, sRGB to linear. And we can skip like half of that long and written out function call. I'll talk a little bit more about this later. Anyway, other lighting values we're going to want to convert. So both of my lights in this 3D scene are just white, and if you raise the color white to any power, it's going to stay white, because 1 raised to anything is still 1. But for the sake of completeness, let us go and give this treatment to the point light color and to the spotlight color, like this. So that's converting all of our necessary color values to linear from sRGB. We are going to do our actual lighting calculations here in linear color space, and then we will want to convert back. So we could basically do the inverse and say S, actually it's going to be linear to sRGB. It's also going to take a vector 3 input. And now instead of returning a value from like raising the input to the power of gamma, am I even saying real words anymore? We are going to invert that function. We are going to raise input to the power of 1.0 divided by gamma. And that's going to put us back in sRGB color space. So let's see. When we say GL underscore frag color equals something, we can say our final color right before the end is going to be linear to sRGB of final color. And that is going to complete the cycle. So we're back in sRGB color space. So if I run the game now, assuming I didn't make any compile errors, which it looks like I did, that's fantastic. Why don't you like the term input? Wait a minute, is input a reserved word in GLSL? It's not getting highlighted, but I feel like I've run into this before. I feel like input is a reserved word in GLSL. If I scroll up in the console, does it give any indication as to what happened here? It might not be GLSL. It might be part of the like GLSL to HLSL translation that GameMaker does behind the scenes. Oh yeah, illegal use of reserved word. All right. Thanks for telling me that here in the compile error form, GameMaker. It really would have helped to see the whole message. But anyway, so we now have something that looks a little bit different, but not like it's perceptibly different. It doesn't make a really huge difference to the overall feel of the scene or anything like that. I am going to go back to our draw event over here, and I'm going to say, if you hold the spacebar, we're going to use the gamma corrected version of the shader, and if you don't hold the spacebar, we're going to use the regular one. And we're going to be able to flip back and forth between the two versions of the shader and see the difference in real time, in side by side. So you can see that in parts of the light that are like close to the source, rather parts of the light that are farther away from the source, the light falls off a little bit more slowly, and that's another thing that I'm going to look at in a little bit. But other than that, it really doesn't make that much of a difference to the overall look and feel of the scene. Anyway, that's gamma correction. So let me go and To make this this next step easier, it's actually going to be a little bit easier to see if I turn off the ambient light entirely. So I'm going to go into both shaders, and I'm going to set the ambient light to a vector 3 of 0. And let's talk about the attenuation of the spotlight. So in real life, if you were to hold up like a lantern or something in the middle of a dark room, the rate that the light would fall off at a distance, the rate that the light would attenuate at a distance, actually is going to be the proportional to the square, or rather inversely proportional to the square of the distance. So if you move something twice as far away from a light source, it's going to receive a quarter of the light. This inverse square relationship is something that pops up pretty often in physics if you've ever done a lot of physics in school. In this case, you can think of it as like the number of photons that an object receives is going to be proportional to like the surface area of a sphere surrounding the light source with a radius of the distance. And since surface area is proportional to distance squared, the number of photons that the object would receive would be proportional to the inverse square. So that would imply, let me go back to the non-gamma corrected version of the shader. So that would imply that your attenuation factor for your spotlights and for our point lights and whatnot should actually be raised to the second power. This is going to be the actual second power, not some weird 2.2 value. But this is usually not done, as far as I can tell, because it usually doesn't actually look that good. So when I do that, our light value is going to fall off a lot faster than it did before. And this has the effect of making it actually really hard to see what's going on. This might be something that you do for some specific artistic reason, like if you're making a horror game and if you really want the light to fall off quickly from the light source, but to have a little bit like towards the edge of the radius of the light. But for the most part, like this doesn't look very good. This doesn't really make it easy to see. We are not going to do this in our ungamma corrected sRGB. I mean, yeah, our ungamma corrected version of the shader. We're just going to leave that as it is. It's going to be a linear fall off. However, when you do this with gamma correction by raising the color values to the power of 2.2, this is actually something you probably do actually want to do. So if I were to do the same thing here in the gamma corrected version of the shader, ATT equals the power of the attenuation 2.0, we can do the same thing down here for the spotlight, for the cone light. So one of the things that you might have noticed when I was flipping back and forth between the two versions of the shader earlier were that with gamma correction, the light was lasting a lot longer towards the radius of, like the outer radius of the light source before it was disappearing. Assuming you don't want that, and again, maybe you do, in which case feel free to avoid this. Assuming you don't want that, it is probably probably not a terrible idea to actually make use of the inverse square over here. Let's see. That is not the button I meant to hit. Were there any other uses where I might want to do this? I don't think so. It's just these two, because I've only got these two lights in the scene. So, just some food for thought. Let's see, some final remarks on this. So, when it comes to things like ambient light color and the color of lights, so I am doing the sRGB conversion in the shader here. There is no reason, if you're providing these values as uniforms to the shader, that you can't pre-compute them in GML before sending them to the shader, just to save on a little bit of extra effort inside the shader itself for every fragment that you resolve. If you do that, just be wary that if you're defining your colors in terms of like 0 to 255 instead of 0 to 1, you're also going to want in the final computation to like multiply 255 or raise 255 to the power of 2.2 and then divide the red, green, blue by that 255 to the power of 2.2 because we do want our color values to be like normalized here. There are some other like minor adjustments that you might make to this for the sake of making your code a little bit cleaner, but I don't really feel the need to split hairs over this further. So I guess before I go, I will do a little bit of editorializing on why I just really don't care about this. Because this is the internet, and people on the internet just don't have enough going on in their lives, and they need more things to argue loudly about. You will find people on the internet arguing loudly about, like, oh, you should never do lighting in sRGB space, you should always do it in linear. If you don't, your game will look bad, and you should feel bad, and your grandma will disown you. whatever. But to me, just flipping back and forth between sRGB and linear, the color space that we're doing our lighting in, this makes such little of a difference to me that things like the material work, or things like the color of the lights, or the placement of the lights, or the colors that you choose for like artistic purposes, to me that sort of thing just makes so much more of a difference in how your 3D scene looks and feels, that I would just rather focus my efforts on so many other different things. Like, this is obviously not super difficult. It's like 3 lines of code and changes that we had to make in like 2 different places in this code. And it's really not that expensive. We're just raising a number to a power and then later inverting it. And if you want to do this in your game for 3D lighting, by all means, I'm not going to stop you or anything. But in the terms of interesting choices that I think there are to make, this is just not an interesting choice. When I was setting this up a couple of weeks ago, I saw this. I saw how little of a difference that it seemed to make. I sent a message to Patrick Crafe, the graphics nerd over at Yo-Yo, and I said something like, am I losing my mind? Am I doing this wrong? Or is this actually just like really not that significant? And he said something like, yeah. I forgot exactly what his exact response was, but it was something like, this is one of the places where like stylization beats realism, or something like that. So I'm gonna end this off here. My name is Michael. I like wizards and dragons and making games. I do like to make videos on weird stuff you can do in GameMaker, so if any of this 3D stuff appeals to you, feel free to subscribe. I have a Patreon, so if you want to contribute to the channel, links to that can be found in all the usual places. You should all go check out Wizarducks and the Lost Hat, which is one of the games that I like to work on when I'm not doing YouTube stuff. Link to the Steam page can be found down below. I hope you all enjoyed that, and I will see you all later. Special thanks to Zenjamin, Squarecrow, SpyDie Games, Manta Ray, GameMaker, GameArt Indie, Edward Holt, DJ Gibbles, and Bokeh Dev for supporting these videos. If you want to contribute to the channel, head on over to the Patreon page down in the video description to join the fun.